You know, I've played through a lot of games, but it's pretty rare when one actually surprises me or completely changes the way I thought about it while playing. Sometimes it's a game everyone overlooked or just didn't talk about, and all of a sudden, you're totally engrossed, wondering how it flew under the radar. Other times, a game got so much hate before release that you almost didn't bother, only to find out it's way better than anyone gave it credit for. So let me show you some of those games, the ones that, for one reason or another, completely surpassed all expectations. First up, we have Alan Wake 2. Now, Alan Wake 2 is one of those games that kind of creeps up on you and suddenly twists the entire genre on its head. You go into it expecting some weird blend of atmospheric horror and psychological suspense, but it's like way more than that. You end up with a game that feels less like just a horror experience and more like an interactive piece of art, blending gaming, cinema, music, and even comic styles all into one package. The storyline isn't made to just deliver scares, but it constantly keeps you guessing what's real and what's just a figment of your imagination. You don't just play Alan Wake, you're like experiencing his psyche directly. On top of that, the game's world makes clever use of lighting and shadows, really nailing the suspense. It's all about building tension, and when the twist hits, it leaves a lasting impact. The way the environment doubles as part of the narrative creates something unique, like a slow burning sense of dread that most horror games don't even attempt. And those eerie forest scenes almost feel alive. It's one of those settings where you don't just feel out of place, but downright unwelcome. There's always this sense that something is lurking, and the game leverages that unease beautifully. That along with its deep, complex narrative means Alan Wake 2 doesn't just meet expectations, it smashes them, pulling you into its chaotic, nightmarish world completely. Next, we've got Guardians of the Galaxy. Of course, Guardians of the Galaxy definitely caught a lot of people off guard. It's easy to be skeptical about a game based on a popular IP when you're used to them being cash-ins, but this one is a huge surprise. You think you're walking into a typical linear action game filled with one-liners and big fights, and yeah, there's plenty of humor, but there's heart in this game, a lot of it. The team banter is really what makes it stand out. You aren't just controlling the Guardians, you feel like you're a part of their emotional ups and downs. Instead of just keeping the jokes and witty remarks flying, Guardians dives deeper into character development than expected. Each of the squad members has their arc, their drama, and they feel fully realized. The combat might feel standard at first glance, but then you start realizing how much synergy there is between the characters. You've got the ability to command teammates mid-fight, which adds a neat dynamic. It feels like you're running the show, not just button mashing through waves. The whole thing kind of starts feeling like a rhythm, teamwork, powers, jokes, all blending together in a perfect groove. Plus, the soundtrack isn't just background noise, it's actively woven into the gameplay experience, fully immersing you into this wacky, spacefaring adventure. Guardians of the Galaxy wasn't just about saving the universe. It's really about the family you're saving it with. It's this emotional depth that makes it way better than anyone expected. Coming in next is Control, which no one really saw coming in the way it hit. You might have gone into it thinking it's just a shooter with supernatural abilities mixed in, telekinesis, cool guns, the basics, right? But the thing is, by the time you're halfway in, you realize it's so much more than that. It tricks you into thinking it's just about combat, and then suddenly the lore kicks in and you're like, whoa, this story's way deeper than you anticipated. There's a growing sense of mystery that grabs you, and next thing you know, you're completely hooked, on edge, trying to figure out what's behind the Bureau's endless layers of secrets. It's not just the narrative, though. The way the environment shifts and warps as you explore is mesmerizing. You feel like the whole world is conspiring against you. The game world almost becomes this unpredictable maze. Doors lead to odd places, rooms don't act like regular rooms. It's strange, sure, but it's incredibly immersive. What really makes Control stand out is how its gameplay flows between moments of quiet, eerie exploration and the intense combat sections. Navigating oppressive government corridors only to suddenly shift into frenetic, psionic-fueled battles ties into the unsettling, off-kilter vibe. The story, the oldest house's architecture, the ambiguous narrative, some really wild puzzle pieces that create something much more ambitious than anticipated. It completely surpassed expectations, offering a truly mind-bending experience. This one's a must-play, Returnal. Now Returnal is one of those games that hooks you in with its fast-paced bullet hell gameplay, and from there, it doesn't let go. Initially, you might think it's just another roguelike experience. Die, restart, and repeat, right? Except in Returnal, every loop feels like it's pushing you deeper into not just the gameplay, but the story itself. The combat's frenetic. I mean, you're constantly dodging and shooting in rhythm, and yet layered under that intensity is this eerie atmosphere and lingering mystery, making your journey feel more significant than it first appears. The randomness of each cycle keeps things fresh, but it's the narrative that really pulls forward. As you die and reawaken, little fragments of what's really going on start piecing together. The planet Atropos holds these creeping personal secrets for protagonist Selene, and suddenly the journey starts feeling more intimate than just running and gunning. Plus, the house sequences are a total game changers. These calm first-person moments throw you off completely, taking you from aggressive survival to psychological horror just like that. And somehow, it all fits seamlessly together. The more you dig in, replay, and die again, the more Returnal becomes this all-consuming experience. It completely smashes any expectations people had about a straightforward action roguelike. What begins as a struggle for survival transforms into so much more.
More hospitals, you got doctors, you got triage, you got a MASH unit.
Oh, look, I'm just a grad student, okay? I got volunteered for this. I'm not even supposed to be out here. Okay.
Now, let's shift our focus to Days Gone. Days Gone. That one surprised a lot of folks, especially after all the talk surrounding its development. You've got this open-world zombie game set in a post-apocalypse, and sure, that's not exactly something new, but start digging into the world, and it turns out the game's way deeper than just another zombie shooter. First off, the world that Ben's studio built feels alive in a way not many expected. The way freakers move as a horde pouring out of buildings, chasing you down across vast landscapes, it's an adrenaline rush like few other games. But then there's the contrast, right? You've got these intense encounters, and the next moment you're cruising through this empty, quiet wilderness on your trusty bike. Just you, the road, and a world that's as dangerous as it is beautiful. And that bike? Way more than just a travel gimmick. It's practically your lifeline. Maintaining and upgrading it becomes this personal mission. But it's Deacon, the protagonist, that pushes the game beyond expectation. At first glance, he's your typical gruff biker guy, just trying to survive. But the deeper you get into the story, the more layers peel back, revealing a guy who's struggling with loss, loyalty, and the search for something meaningful. The emotional depth caught a lot of players off guard. Sure, Days Gone has its share of bugs and rough edges, but underneath, there's a surprisingly rich world worth exploring. It's a game a lot of people slept on, then realized later it had way more heart than they ever expected.
The goddamn grid.
Next up is Death Stranding. Death Stranding threw everyone for a loop, especially with that whole walking simulator label flying around. Walking from point A to point B sounds kind of mundane, right? Except there's this calm that takes over when you're trekking through this massive, desolate landscape. You start realizing it's less about the action and more about the journey. The game gets in your head a bit. It's slow burn storytelling at its finest, where every delivery or trek across difficult terrain scratches at these themes of survival, connection, and isolation. Plus, the world feels massive yet incredibly lonely, which plays into the whole concept. Traversing mountains, fields, and ruined cities, you encounter scattered reminders that you aren't alone, even when you kind of are. You leave behind ladders and ropes for other players, or stumble across someone's abandoned vehicle, and out of nowhere, it all feels more alive, like you're part of a bigger thing. The story? Yeah, that's where it takes off. You've got these really surreal elements. Phantom creatures, rain that manipulates time, blended with super intimate moments about family, sacrifice, and rebuilding society. It's a deeply human game dressed up like sci-fi, blending the weirdness of Kojima's storytelling with real emotional weight. Death Stranding might seem slow or strange at first, but by the end, it weaves everything together into this really profound story about connection in a disconnected world.
Who rise with the moon in darkness? Who prepares the path for the midnight sun?
Moving on to Marvel's Midnight Suns. So with Marvel's Midnight Suns, a lot of folks, probably including you, were curious about how they were going to mix a card-based tactical system with Marvel superheroes. I mean, it sounds like a weird combo. It's hard to picture Wolverine and Captain Marvel waiting their turn during a fight, right? Yet somehow it all works. You're looking at this hybrid of deck building and turn-based strategy that blends way better than expected. You've got this deep RPG feel, but instead of managing basic stats like in some other RPG tactics games, you're controlling heroes with powers that feel epic. The card system adds some randomness that keeps fights fresh, but it's not random enough to be frustrating. You still feel in control, plotting out who does what, where. And the best thing, it feels like every move counts, not just in a strategic way, but in how the game represents the characters. Ghost Rider pulling off a massive hell ride or Doctor Strange casting these insane spells doesn't feel like a basic command. It's theatrical, leaning into who they are as heroes. Outside of combat, the relationship building part is subtle but very rewarding. You're hanging with these icons, talking, strategizing. It's that quieter side of hero life that's usually missing in other Marvel games. The game finds this perfect spot between tactical layers, RPG elements, and the larger-than-life superhero spectacle, making Midnight Suns way more memorable and complex than just a cash-in superhero title. Now we have Shadow of the Colossus. Right from the opening sequence, something feels different. It's not your average action game. You're not fighting small guys or upgrading weapons constantly. You're just dropped into this massive, lonely world with 16 walking fortresses to take down. The world feels empty in a haunting way, and it's that solitude that makes each encounter with a Colossus feel monumental. That's the brilliance of this game. Nothing in between. Just you, your horse, and these titanic creatures that feel like they've been living there forever. Each Colossus is a puzzle in itself, and the first time you're climbing one, that sense of scale just hits you. It's not frantic action, but more like a slow climb up this moving mountain as you figure out how to bring it down. But it's the design, this almost minimalist focus on nature, size, and silence, that makes it so memorable. The world's emptiness is part of the story, not just the background set. You feel like you're disturbing something ancient, like each fight is more than just a boss battle. It's not a game you blow through, it sticks with you long after. Shadow of the Colossus doesn't just meet expectations, it defines what games can do. Making it a masterpiece, you kind of feel obligated to recommend to anyone with a controller. Another solid entry on the list is The Last Guardian. Now, The Last Guardian kind of had its share of skeptics, which makes sense when one of the game's key mechanics is relying on an AI-controlled giant companion. Trico, this massive creature, feels alive but also stubborn, unpredictable, and frequently frustrating. Walking into it, some folks were looking for that next big technical leap post-Shadow of the Colossus, but what The Last Guardian does instead is something more emotional. The bond between the boy and Trico is the heart of the game. It just takes patience to get there. You're going through a lot of puzzles and platforming, and yeah, sometimes Trico just doesn't listen. The thing is, that frustration? It's part of what makes The Last Guardian so different. Trico isn't this perfect, obedient companion. He acts like a real animal. You have to earn his trust by caring for him and figuring out how to communicate. And when he finally listens or saves the boy from danger, it feels earned. It's one of those slower, more meditative experiences that definitely won't appeal to action junkies, but it rewards patience in ways that most games just don't even attempt. By the end, if you've let the dynamic between you and Trico click, it feels like you've gone through something truly special. Persistence pays off. The Last Guardian might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's one of the most emotionally unique games out there. Frustrating moments and all. Now, let's move on to Cult of the Lamb. Cult of the Lamb is one of those games that sounds completely bizarre, but delivers way beyond what anyone expected. You're starting this cute little cult. Yeah, cult. But instead of the dark, gritty vibe you'd imagine, it's got this adorable, cartoony art style that makes everything look harmless. Then you dive into it, and it's like this mix between traditional roguelike dungeon crawling and a strange, surprisingly deep cult management sim. The way these two totally different genres blend is where the fun really kicks in. You're going from slashing enemies in chaotic combat to chilling out in your base, where you're micromanaging your followers. Each follower has their own little quirks. They might be lazy, or they might just randomly drop dead during a ritual, and you'll find yourself actually caring. It's wild how personal things get when you're deciding if you're gonna sacrifice them or help them grow into fanatical devotees. The pacing between combat and base building is where Cult of the Lamb keeps things engaging. You're never stuck in one place for too long. One minute you're fighting bosses, the next you're planting crops or giving a wild sermon to your followers. It avoids feeling repetitive by constantly shifting between the two, all while wrapping everything up in its charmingly sinister tone. It's addictively weird, and way more polished than you'd expect from an indie title about cute cultists. Alright, before we jump into the next game, if you're enjoying this list so far, make sure to drop a like and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more awesome content. Let's continue with Mad Max. Now, Mad Max is one of those games folks weren't necessarily expecting much from, especially with its release tied to a movie franchise. Historically, movie-tied games haven't had the best track record. But here's the thing, Mad Max is way more than just a quick cash-in. The wasteland is massive, open, and honestly feels just as desolate and hostile as it was in the films. You feel the brutality right away. The vehicular combat is also another highlight. Sure, you're roaming around, beating enemies on foot, upgrading your gear, typical action game stuff, but once you hop inside the magnum opus, it's a whole different experience. The car becomes part of you, really. You're souping it up, adding armor, spikes, harpoon guns, all to survive these relentless Mad Max-style vehicular skirmishes. The car combat feels visceral, weighty, like you're always on the edge of losing control, but in a good way. What's funny, though, is that while it's set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland with all the dirt and chaos you'd expect, there's something oddly satisfying about rebuilding in this kind of world. Fixing up strongholds, establishing outposts, it makes the world feel more like it's alive and worth protecting, even though it's constantly trying to kill you. Mad Max exceeded expectations, delivering gritty, raw action and surprisingly deep exploration.
Run! We have to land! We have to land or the storms are going to crash us! We can't leave!
Another solid entry on the list is the 2013 Tomb Raider. The Tomb Raider trilogy reboot was already hyped when it came out. There were obvious comparisons flying around between the new Lara Croft and other action-adventure protagonists. You start with a younger, more vulnerable Lara, and the transformation from survivalist to adventurer feels earned. It wasn't just a power fantasy from the get-go. The game took its time to build her character, and that caught a lot of people off guard. What the first Tomb Raider from the trilogy did exceptionally well was blending exploration and combat in this really fluid, satisfying way. You're constantly in motion, climbing, jumping, tomb raiding, obviously, but the game also mixes in some solid gunfights and surprisingly brutal moments of survival. Plus, the puzzle elements from the older Tomb Raider games aren't just thrown in for nostalgia, they're more organic. And the balance between traversal and thinking felt way better than expected. The island setting also brought this eerie but beautiful backdrop for the game's pacing. It feels like a perfect place for Lara to cut her teeth as an explorer and a survivor. There's vulnerability, but also this slow but sure emergence of the Lara Croft that feels like the one you know from the more classic games. That first game in the trilogy is the reason the whole reboot resonated so strongly with players. You're drawn into Lara's rise, not just as an adventurer, but as someone piecing together who they're meant to be. Here's one that may have flown under your radar, Lies of P. Now, Lies of P, that one kinda came out of nowhere for a lot of folks. On the surface, you might have gone into it thinking it's another Souls-like, maybe something inspired by games like Bloodborne, but without expecting anything new. Then you start playing and realize, nope, this thing is way more than a copycat. It's polished, intricate, and wildly immersive, creating an atmosphere that feels both familiar and completely fresh at the same time. The gameplay is super tight. You're getting that Souls-like challenge with well-thought-out combat mechanics that feel rewarding when you nail them, but frustrating in that good way when you fall short. What caught most players off guard, including me, wasn't just how well the mechanics were executed, but the presentation. The world of Lies of P oozes style, drawing from steampunk aesthetics and weaving in a narrative that plays with the tale of Pinocchio in ways that somehow just work. It's like exploring a twisted fairy tale where everything is familiar, yet warped into something dark and eerie. Each encounter feels deliberate, and the enemy design keeps things unpredictable without becoming unfair. You're getting this classic Souls-like loop while also unraveling a story that's more engaging than expected. The balance between exploration, combat, and narrative surprises hits the spot. Lies of P isn't just another game in a popular genre. It's a standout experience that absolutely could hold its own next to the genre's big names, with its atmosphere and polish taking it over the top. Up next is the 2016 Doom. This was a wild ride, especially if you remember how skeptical folks were before it dropped. The beta for the multiplayer? Yikes. People were ready to write it off. But then the full game hit and suddenly it was clear. They nailed it. Speed, aggression, intensity. It wasn't just another modern FPS. Doom went back to its roots, cranked the dial up, and made something biblical out of demon slaying again. The thing that really stood out was how fast it was. No reloading, no hiding behind cover for minutes on end. It's sprint, shoot, punch, repeat. You're not just playing a shooter, you're ripping through waves of enemies like a hurricane of gunfire and guts. And that flow, oh man, that's key. The game forces you to stay in constant motion, rewarding you for high-octane aggression over playing it safe. Every glory kill keeps you topped up on health, ammo, or armor, encouraging this state of organized chaos that, quite frankly, just wasn't being done anywhere else at the time. And let's not even get started on the soundtrack. The musical score is all about energy, adding this visceral punch to every battle. The thumping bass of the heavy metal tracks fuels the hellish atmosphere in perfect synergy with the gameplay. While the multiplayer of this game is already not as good as it was before, it's clear that Doom took a franchise that many wrote off and made it the blueprint for a modern FPS without losing any of the speed and brutality that made the series legendary in the first place.
I'm here, baby.
Who are you talking to? Just head to Rekka's office.
Another brilliant entry is Hi-Fi Rush. Now, nobody saw Hi-Fi Rush coming. Dropped out of the blue, without all the usual marketing buzz, it just hit like a rhythm-infused gut punch. And that's exactly what you get with this game, rhythm. It's like if your favorite action platformers met a rock concert and decided to take you along for the ride. On paper, combining rhythmic combat with a punchy cel-shaded aesthetic sounds a bit out there, but it absolutely clicks once you pick up the controller. The whole gimmick is this concept where everything, combat, movement, even the world, pulses to the beat of the music. At first it seems like it might be too gimmicky or hard to pull off, but surprisingly it's the opposite. The rhythm actually makes the gameplay feel smoother, even more intuitive. You're empowered to time your attacks to the beat, giving every punch and dodge this satisfying, almost musical flair. Then add in the animation, which pops with comic book energy, and suddenly you've got a game that's hyper-stylized, visually electric, and ridiculously fun. Instead of being just another rhythm-based game, Hi-Fi Rush feels fresh, marrying action-based gameplay to a beat without feeling forced. The humor is on point, and the pacing is tight. The whole thing comes together way better than anyone expected, proving that rhythm-based action can work, and that surprises like this are still very welcome.
Immortality? For that word, all realms and beings have ruined themselves.
Now, let's keep things rolling with Black Myth Wukong. Years ago, when the first videos for Black Myth Wukong dropped, there was this natural skepticism. It just looked too good to be true. A brand new studio shooting for an intense, stunning action RPG with intricate combat and jaw-dropping visuals? A lot of people thought it might just be a glorified tech demo or a game too ambitious to live up to its potential. Fast forward to its release, and it's way more than anyone hoped for. Clocking in at around 40 hours of solid content, the studio didn't just make an impressive action game. They crafted a whole world where mythology, combat, and exploration intertwine in beautiful harmony. The game pulls heavily from Chinese folklore, weaving its mythological roots seamlessly into the frame of a modern action RPG. You feel the weight of the source material, but you're also immersed in this sleek design filled with fluid, exhilarating combat. The transformations aren't just flashy. Every form has utility and helps you approach enemies and challenges in different ways. It all feels purposeful, not just a list of cool abilities to cycle through. The boss fights carry the weight of mythological legends, and each encounter requires mastery and precision rather than brute force button mashing. You're drawn into its world by the sheer creativity behind the enemy and boss designs, each screaming originality while maintaining that traditional feel. Performance issues do creep in, especially on the PlayStation 5, where optimization still leaves room for improvement. But considering this is Game Science's first major title, it's hard not to be impressed by what they've achieved. Black Myth Wukong delivers on every cautious hope and promise, proving it's not just an early development fluke. It's a solid mythological adventure crafted with care and respect for both the lore and modern gaming standards, which is pretty unreal for a first-time studio.
I got some water. You need to stay hydrated.
Up next, we have Dead Island 2. Talk about development limbo. Dead Island 2 spent 9 long years in the pipeline, going through what felt like development purgatory. First announced back in 2014, it became one of those projects many thought would just fade away, or if it eventually released, limp out as a shell of what was originally promised. And yet, after all that time, it came out swinging and ended up being one of the most fun games of 2023. Who could have predicted that? The game leans into its sun-baked zombie mayhem vibe, flipping the whole post-apocalypse trope by planting you in a bright, vibrant, gore-filled version of Los Angeles. You've got luxury mansions and iconic landmarks, all infested with hordes of zombies, but what's wild is how detailed all of it is. The environmental design isn't just window dressing, it's interactive, letting you get creative with how to take out the zombie horde, trying new ways to dispatch zombies with environmental traps, or weaponizing just about everything within reach feels both fresh and ridiculously satisfying. The combat system is ultra meaty. You feel every hit, every weapon swing in a way that makes the violence somehow fun. It's bloody, sure, but there's an undeniable thrill to the approach. Sure, the game doesn't deviate too much from the tried and true zombie formula in a narrative sense, but where it really shines is turning the whole thing into an endless playground of destruction and experiments with its mechanics. Dead Island 2 proves that even after delays and changes in direction, a game can still deliver an insane amount of actually fun zombie slaying.
Okay, update time. You heard back from Jen yet?
No. I'm sure she'll reply at some point.
Let me take a look at the situation.
Coming in next is Life is Strange 2. So, Life is Strange 2 is one of those games that you might not expect much from going in, especially if you haven't played the first one. Some players skipped around it thinking it was just another emotional, choice-based saga. But wow, it ended up hitting way deeper than a lot of people anticipated. Unlike the first game, this one focuses on a whole new cast, and you're thrown into these really heavy, real situations, with 2 brothers, Sean and Daniel, on the run. There's no safety net. You pretty much go into it blind, especially if you're unfamiliar with the universe, but that actually works in its favor. While the game takes place in the same universe as the original, it forges its own story. Playing them out of order doesn't leave you missing context. In fact, it might even make you appreciate the depth of the world more. The bond between the Diaz brothers and their developing trust, or lack of it, as you make heart-wrenching decisions turns what might have seemed like a simple narrative into something so much more layered. You get attached, you feel responsible. By the end, you start thinking about family, sacrifice, independence, big things. You totally didn't need to know about Max or Arcadia Bay to appreciate the emotional roller coaster. It stands alone while blending seamlessly into the existing universe. This game might not have had the same cultural buzz as the first game, but the weight it carries? Hard to ignore once you dive in. Here's a title you definitely don't want to miss, Gotham Knights. Gotham Knights dropped with a whole lot of negativity circling around it, especially given how beloved the Arkham series is, right? And yeah, it didn't quite come out swinging like people hoped. But here's the thing, when you ignore the internet noise and actually get into the game, there's a lot of fun to be had. The big draw here is that the world feels like Gotham, an actual living, breathing city this time, not just set pieces for a story. NPCs are wandering the streets, events happen around you, and while some might say the open world feels a bit sparse, it gives you a solid little playground that still captures those vibes from the Arkham games. What really grabs you, though, are the multiple playable characters. Each of them, Nightwing, Red Hood, Batgirl, and Robin, feels unique, with different fighting styles and abilities. The game has these superb details in combat and how you interact with the environment based on who's in play. Sure, it's not as tight as an Arkham title, but it leans into co-op gameplay in a way you wouldn't expect. The character development between them are absolutely solid. You get invested in their personal stories, their relationships with each other, and their individual growth throughout the game. And then there's Gotham itself. The game nails that gothic, gritty aesthetic that's been a staple in so many Batman stories. You're constantly reminded that Gotham is this brooding, crime-infested city that just never gets a break, even with Batman gone. The story itself may not revolutionize the superhero genre, but it gives you enough weight to feel like you're part of Gotham's legacy. Gotham Knights is one of those games where, if you give it a chance, it rewards your time with genuine immersive fun. To wrap things up, we've got Sleeping Dogs. The game that's always kind of been in that conversation about hidden gems, but never quite got its due. Everyone tosses around the comparison to GTA, but that really doesn't capture what makes Sleeping Dogs stand out. Sure, it's got open-world crime elements, but it leans so much harder into the martial arts and Hong Kong crime film vibes. You're not just running and gunning here. The emphasis on hand-to-hand combat makes this game feel different from any other open-world game. The martial arts combat is slick. It's not just about mashing buttons, but there's a real rhythm to it, dodging, countering, and pulling off brutal combo finishers. You feel the crunch of every hit, especially in close quarters, and it makes fights satisfying in a way that most open-world games don't even aim for. And then there's the story. You're Wei Shen, a cop who's gone so deep undercover that sometimes you even forget which side you're on. The narrative doesn't just push forward a gangster story, it walks the razor's edge between being loyal to law enforcement and getting pulled into the Brotherhood of the Triads. What's also amazing is how Hong Kong is as much a character in the game as anyone else. The bustling streets, the food stalls, the chaotic traffic, it all feels alive, vibrant, and grounded in reality. Plus, the RPG elements like unlocking new outfits and earning bonuses for wearing them give you extra motivation to explore, do side jobs, and, adopt the occasional pet. Look, Sleeping Dogs could have been a basic open-world game, but it threw all the right punches instead. It's truly something that takes the familiar and reinvents it, infused with Hong Kong action cinema energy you'd never expect. Hands down, a criminally underrated gem and one that sticks with you way longer than most of the genre giants. So those are just a few of the games that totally surprised me, in a good way. Have you had any games like that? Titles you didn't expect much from but ended up hooked? Let us know in the comments below. And hey, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Hope to see you in the next video.